the Battle of Jericho, the battle that was fought by the Israelites, led by a man named Joshua. Last week in our series, we talked about the parting of the Red Sea, how God had delivered the people of Israel from the hands of the Egyptians and put them on the path toward the promised land. This is 40 years later. Not that it takes 40 years to get from the Red Sea to Jericho, but because the people became very self-centered and they began to complain against the Lord, and they began to worship false gods that their own hands had made. And they weren't focused on God so much anymore, and so God decided that he was going to make the people wander and wait for 40 years. He was still going to deliver them to the promised land, but it wasn't going to be the whole nation of Israel. And actually, God punished them by saying, your children will inherit this land, but all of the adults at the time of the Exodus, they're going to perish before getting to the promised land. And in particular, that affected Moses as well. That Moses died before he was able to go into the promised land, so there had to be a new leader. That's who Joshua was. This young, courageous man who was going to lead the Israelites into the land that God had promised. And now one of the cities that's standing in between them and possession of the land is the city of Jericho. And as Joshua is thinking about how he's going to defeat the people that live within Jericho, he could be filled with a lot of doubt. He had some reason to doubt his chances against them. For one thing, the people of Canaan were huge. They were bigger, taller, built like NFL linebackers. The Israelites didn't seem to physically have a chance against them. For another thing, Israel's military wasn't all that great. They had just spent 40 years in the desert, in the wilderness, not fighting against anybody. They didn't even kill their own food. God fed them from heaven, the manna that came down from heaven. So they were a little bit out of practice, and they didn't have the greatest, the most organized army or the most advanced weaponry. And Joshua also could have been full of doubts because of this great big wall that surrounded the city of Jericho. How are we going to get through that wall? And even though there were these reasons to doubt, Joshua displays great faith in the promises of God. He learns a lesson and really teaches us a lesson here about trusting in God's perspective, in his plan, and in his power instead of our own. But that lesson was taught to Joshua in a very interesting way. If you look at how our lesson begins this morning, toward the end of chapter 5 in the book of Joshua, it says that now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and he saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand, right? A very aggressive stance to find somebody in. The sword is drawn, looking like he's ready to attack. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied, "but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." Then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, "What message does my Lord have for his servant?" Who is this man standing before him with a drawn sword? Not just any man. He says that he's the commander of the Lord's army. Does that make him an angel or an archangel? Maybe. But there is also reason to believe that he's more than that. That this might even be God himself standing in front of him, and maybe one of those circumstances where it's the pre-incarnate Christ standing before him in bodily form. That happens a few times in the Old Testament. If you think about Abraham being visited by a priest, or you think about Jacob being visited by a wrestler, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are joined in that fiery furnace with one who looks like a son of God. Right? In each of those cases, there is good reason to say that that is more than just an angel, but that just might be God himself, and maybe even the Son of God. And there's a reason to one of the ways you can tell is anytime that an angel appears to somebody in the scripture, and that person bows down to worship that angel or bows down in front of the angel, the angel says, "No, don't worship me. I'm just a messenger. I have a message for you. Don't bow down and worship me." But in this case, when Joshua falls face down in front of this man with his drawn sword, what happens? The commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." Just like he told Moses when he spoke to Moses from within the burning bush. And Joshua did so. So that is who this person is, the commander of the Lord's army, probably even God himself. I think it's interesting the question that Joshua asks him initially. Are you for us or for our enemies? The man replies, neither. Are you on our team or are you on their team? He says, neither. I think that's really interesting and maybe leads to our first point this morning, that we should be concerned about God's perspective, not our own. I think that's increasingly important as we live in an increasingly polarized world where every topic is so divisive and you need to pick sides. Are you on our team or are you on their team? And both sides claim that God is on their team. Maybe the question that we should be asking is not, is God on our side or their side? The question is, am I taking God's perspective into account here? Am I looking at things the way that God would? Because this commander of the Lord's army says, no, that's not how this works. I don't choose one of your sides. I tell you who I am and what I'm going to do, and then you follow me or not.